With me now is the director of Bipartisan Policy Center's National Security Program, Blaise Misztal. Blaise, thanks for being here.
Good to be with you.
All right, this claim from the Turkish government that the media company has ties to terror, is that a legitimate claim?
Well, first of all, let's be clear. Turkey does have a terrorism problem. In the course of the last 9 months, we've seen at least 6 major terrorist attacks, some carried out by ISIS, some carried out by other groups with ties to Kurdish militants. But rather than going against those terrorist groups and trying to solve its security threats, the Turkish government has declared that it's going to fight terrorists without guns and terrorists without bombs. And by that, it means journalists and academics and anyone who disagrees with it. And I think making that connection, suggesting that because someone disagrees with the government, they're automatically a threat to the state, is illegitimate, especially when you have terrorists with bombs and terrorists with guns. That should be the real focus of Turkey's security policy right now.
Right, but do these media companies have ties to terror? Because there are state-run media, there are corporations who fund terrorist organizations. That would be a legitimate reason for a government to overtake it. Do these media companies have ties to terrorists?
To the best of our knowledge, they don't. And in fact, the terrorist group that they supposedly have ties to is called the Fethullah Gulen terrorist group. It's actually a faith-based movement that has come out against the Erdogan government with their chief spiritual leader residing here in the United States. And to make the claim that this religious organization is in fact tied to terrorism, at least there have been no real evidence presented by the Turkish government to suggest they're anything other than a spiritual movement.
So it's political then. This is basically based in corruption, in opposition of the government trying to squelch the opposition.
That's right. Actually, what you've seen in Turkey over the course of the last 3 or 4 years is increasing amounts of cracking down on dissent. And it's gone from going after individual journalists, either having them beat up in the street by thugs or trying to get them fired, to now going after whole media companies, where, as we've seen, the state comes in, takes over these companies, and overnight, they completely switch their stance. It would be as if One America or Fox got taken over by the government and was suddenly towing the Obama administration line.
Now, does Turkey have any constitutional protections for freedom of the press, or are these journalists without any recourse?
Well, Turkey has both constitutional protections, but they also have very strong anti-terror laws because of the fact that they have a terrorist threat in their country, and this has been a problem going back 20, 30 years. So they've developed very strong security laws to enable the government to do what it needs to do to crack down on terrorism. But the problem is that these laws are being now perverted in a way to apply to the media. And what you've seen is the government find new and interesting uses of the laws that they have. For example, the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who's in D.C. actually this week, filed more than 1,500 individual lawsuits against people who he deems insulted him on Twitter, on TV, in columns they wrote, or ordinary citizens and things that they said. So he's been going after anyone by any means that he has to try to get them to not say anything critical of his government.
Right, and Blaise, I've found through observation that when a government wants to get around their laws, when they want to use your word, pervert their laws, when they want to exert power, they'll find a way to do it, regardless of the constitutional or legislative protections. And it seems like Turkey is sliding closer and closer to tyranny. But let's talk about the Turkish people for a second, because I always like to separate governments from the people, because governments can be tyrannical, but it's not always a representation of what the people want. What's the public's response to this been?
It's been mixed. Turkey is extremely polarized. It's divided down the middle almost exactly 50-50. We had elections in Turkey last year. There were actually 2 parliamentary elections. The first election actually resulted in President Erdogan's party receiving a much smaller share of the vote than he expected, not enough to win a parliamentary majority. And what he did, in effect, is rather than form a coalition government, is force a redo. And one of the things he used to try to force that redo was the threat of terrorism, saying our country is in a state of emergency, we're under attack, we're in a crisis, we need to have another election because you need to elect a strong leader. And the second go-around, his party got 49% of the vote. That means there's 51% of the voters in Turkey that do not support his government, but they're divided between multiple different parties that aren't strong enough by themselves to stand up to the president.
Right, and even so that 49%. even that 49% might be just caving to the fear that he's threatening, because if someone threatens you with terrorism, a lot of people are going to think about the interests of their own family, their own livelihood, and cave to that. But Blaise, what's going to happen here? It seems like they're at a tipping point between freedom and almost war. What do you see happening?
Well, I think you just put your finger on it. It's not just a question of authoritarianism in Turkey. It's a question of the ties between authoritarianism and instability. There's a civil war raging in two of the countries on Turkey's border, in Syria and in Iraq. ISIS has deeply penetrated Turkey already. There's a war already going on in Turkey's southeast between the state and Kurdish militants. And Turkey really needs to be able to address that to continue to be the U.S. partner that we'd like to see them to be in the fight against terrorism, in the attempt to stabilize the situation in Syria and Iraq. But the slide into authoritarianism means that the country is going to be polarized. 50% of the people will fight for the government. 50% of the people are going to come out on the streets against the government. And it's really going to limit the ability of the country to do what it needs to do to protect itself and to have a regional influence.
Right.
So the more you actually see tyranny in Turkey, the more instability you'll see there.
Right, and they're also dealing at the same time with the refugee crisis in Europe. They've been sending a lot of refugees to Greece. Now there's a deal between the European Union to send them back. Tell me what you think about this. I personally think it's Turkey trying to become part of the European Union. But is this deal between them, is this going to work in regards to the migrants?
Well, it won't work for a number of reasons. And the major one is because Turkey has found a source of leverage over Europe. It has, in fact, blackmailed Europe to say, if you don't want these people flowing into Europe from Turkey, give us what we want. And any time it decides it wants more from Europe, all it has to do is sort of loosen the controls at its borders and send another wave of refugees into Turkey, or into Europe. So what we're going to see is Turkey's attempt to continually revise the terms of this deal. And you're also going to see Europe get to a breaking point where it's no longer able to pay. They've already promised 6 billion euros to Turkey to keep the refugees in. If Turkey keeps coming back and demanding more, they're not going to be able to provide that. And also, Turkey has asked that in return, Europe no longer criticize Turkey's human rights record. And I think a lot of Europeans are going to resist that.
Right, and this potentially, and correct me if I'm wrong here, this potentially is just going to make the environment in Turkey less safe than it already is, because they're going to have, their objective is going to be towards Europe, towards pacifying the European Union, towards trying to garner favor from them, not towards the refugees or what's going on in their own country.
That's right, and the other problem is that Turkey can't house as many refugees as the Europeans would like them to. Turkey already has 3 million refugees. That number is growing every day. It's a financial strain on Turkey. It's a social strain on Turkey. The Turkish people, a lot of places don't want them there. And it also introduces an increased security risk in Turkey because we don't know who these refugees are and what they're trying to do. And so sooner or later, that's also going to be another source of friction in Turkey that, if not watched and not addressed, is going to boil over.
Right, and we've already seen that happen in Europe and in other parts of the world. It's just a matter of time till it happens in Turkey if they take more refugees. Blaise, we are out of time. I appreciate you coming on the show. It was great to talk to you.